Good evening, fellows, and welcome to tonight's event that has kindly been put on by the British Cartographic Society. Thank you, Chris, for turning the slides off. If anybody doesn't know me, I'm Paul Naylor. I'm the Vice President of the British Cartographic Society, and I'm really pleased to announce that tonight we have Dr. Adrian Fox, formerly of the British Antarctic Survey, who has very kindly agreed to give up his time this evening and come and talk to us. I think this is the first virtual Fellows event we've run. Elaine, if you want to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is. But hopefully,
no, it's the first one. Yeah, it is the first one.
It is the first one.
Yeah.
Great. So hopefully, this will be the one of many going forward. That's the plan anyway, both virtually and in person. So please do look out for them as and when they pop up as part of our program. So just to give you a little bit of background on Adrian before I hand over, he joined the British Antarctic Survey way back in 1990, so a few years ago. He was head of the British Antarctic Survey Mapping and Geographic Information Centre from 2003 to 2021 and completed 15 GNSS survey and aerial photography fieldwork campaigns in both Antarctica and South Georgia. Adrian was also the UK representative at the International Standing Committee on Antarctic Geographic Information from 2003 to 2020, serving as its co-chief officer from 2012 to 2020. And he was also the secretary to the UK Antarctic Place-names Committee from 2014 to 2021. So he's had quite a few roles in his time. He's been a member of BCS since 1991, and Adrian's career at BAS has spanned a time of dramatic improvements in Antarctic topographic mapping in parallel with wider geospatial paradigm shifts from analogue to digital mapping and ground-based to remote sensing methods, something I'm sure many of us can relate to. And Adrian retired earlier in the year, back in March. But without further ado, Adrian, I will hand over to you, if that's okay.
Right, yeah, thanks very much, Paul. So I'll just share my screen and then get going. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming along tonight. I think there's only 12 or so of us, so, hopefully we can have a kind of, more like a kind of nice chat at the end. So anyway, what I want to cover this evening is a bit of brief background about Antarctica and British Antarctic Survey and how I ended up working on Antarctic mapping. What was the state of topographic mapping of Antarctica in 1990 when I started working in this field? And then have a look at some of the key events and developments that have transformed mapping of Antarctica between then and now. Got a few examples of how rigorous mapping methods can help environmental science projects. And then I've got a few slides at the end about what the future might look like. But just a kind of few comments to begin with. I think everyone always thinks that they live through a time of great change, but I truly think that that's actually been the case over the last 30 years. And as Paul said, you can kind of sum that up really as the analog to digital paradigm shift. And I think if you got somebody working in the surveying and mapping field in the 1920s and showed them the kind of technology that was around in the late 80s, they will probably recognize it and have a pretty good idea of how it worked. But I think if you took somebody from the end of the 80s and showed them the kind of systems and tools and technology that we've got now, they would just find it mind-boggling. So the idea of universal computers, digital maps on your phone, the ability to see penguins from space, GPS accuracy to half a tennis court on your watch, it's really, really quite extraordinary, the pace of change over the last 30 years. And it's interesting how that's impacted on Antarctic mapping. So looking back, my master's thesis in 1989 was handwritten and I paid a typist. And when I tell that to the people in my team who are in their 20s, now they just look at me like I'm an idiot. My first mapping job was in pen and ink. And in 1990, there were very few computers. You had to go to a special room to find a computer. It's the very beginning of the email and internet. And I can still only type Antarctica, as that's the only word I can type without looking at the keyboard. So there you go. So I'm mainly going to focus on topographic mapping and the field work for it. So Magic does lots more geospatial things as well, but these are the areas that's been my personal field. And I'm going to really talk about British Antarctic Territory, BAT, and South Georgia, but there have been similar parallel developments in other parts of Antarctica. Some of it probably looks fairly primitive now, but I think it's important to remember that everyone always does the best they can with the materials and the methods of the time. And I kind of learned this the hard way when I was giving a tour for some old BAS and old Antarctica hands. And I was showing them our new map of Bird Island that you can see on the right. So made with digital photogrammetry with a DEM for the contours and an ortho backdrop. And I was contrasting it with the old map on the left. And then suddenly a voice piped up from the back, "Oi, I did that." So I kind of learned that you've got to be quite respectful to what's gone before. Okay, a quick reminder about Antarctic geography, because not everyone is south looking. So yeah, so they've got Antarctica, and the British sector is the red kind of pizza slice that you can see on the right. And important to note that that's also shared with Argentina and Chile, and you can see that other countries have territorial claims. They're all put in abeyance, so the kind of political issues around that aren't particularly live at the moment, but the area that we focus on and have responsibility for is that red triangle. So the BAS mapping department's got two roles: to do the primary topographic mapping of that red triangle area, and then also to provide geospatial support to UK science operations and also foreign policy objectives in Antarctica. So British presence in Antarctica, we've got 5 Antarctic research stations and 2 summer field camps, effectively petrol stations for the aircraft. There are 5 aircraft. There's the Royal Research Ship, Sir David Attenborough, about 420 staff in total, 9 of us in the mapping department. And so, all of this supports BAS's own science as part of NERC and ultimately UCRI, but we're also the logistics provider for UK university scientists and international collaborators. And the annual budget's about 50 million. I think the key to remember is that it's actually a really huge area. So British Antarctic Territory is about 8 times the size of Great Britain. Antarctica as a whole, 52 times the size. And down on the left, you've got a kind of graphic showing the operating area covered by BAS Logistics, which is actually larger than British Antarctic Territory. So you can see that on the right of the graphic at the bottom left. And if you transpose that onto Europe with Rotherham, our main station of London, you can see we're going right over into kind of Ukraine and down into Turkey and into North Africa. So it's actually a really vast area. And you can imagine that all of that kind of logistics really runs on a lot of geospatial data. I like to think about geospatial data as being the glue that sticks everything else together. So when you say Antarctica to people, they often think about Captain Scott and his men pulling their sledges over this vast, empty, flat whiteness. And the continental interior is actually flat and white like that. But the Antarctic Peninsula, the largest part of British Antarctic Territory, is actually a really rugged mountain chain. So the photo you can see there, that's from the northern end, spectacular mountain straight out of the sea to 3,000 meters. Glaciers coming down to the sea, thousands and thousands of islands. And there's actually an island group called the Myriad Islands. Whereas further south, then you've really got just the tops of the mountains poking out of the ice sheet, which can be more than 1,000 meters thick there. So you've got these rock outcrops called nunataks. That will be a typical scene at the southern end of the Antarctic Peninsula. Little bit about South Georgia. 170 kilometers long or so, goes up to 2,900 meters. It's a really stunning place with incredible mountain and glacial scenery. Lots of history tied up with sealing and whaling, the Shackleton Crossing story, really, really amazing wildlife. And it's important now as a laboratory for ecosystem science. And also it's a quite heavily visited tourship destination. So again, lots of mapping and geospatial support needed for that. So yeah, as you can see, really stunning place. Lots of history tied up with the whaling stations, had their peak in the 1920s, top left, but now in quite a bad state of disrepair. And really, really amazing world-class wildlife. David Attenborough has South Georgia in his top 3 places that he's been to, which is really quite something, along with the Amazon and the Serengeti. So lots to go at there. And sometimes you get the wildlife and the scenery together. So a little bit about how did I end up at BAS. I want this really to be about the mapping rather than about my career, so try and keep this brief. I'm in my late 50s. A lot of people of my generation grow up vaguely knowing about the whole Captain Scott story. Actually, my school in Oldham had a sponsored walk and raised money and bought a dog for Captain Scott's expedition. And then I'd always had a sort of interest in maps. And then later on, I was in the Army Cadets and did lots of map reading and things like that. Went off to university in '83, did a geography degree in Edinburgh. And whilst I was there, I got increasingly interested in surveying and mapping, remote sensing and glaciology, as well as going to the mountains lots and using maps in that context. I think everyone has somebody in their career who was their inspiration. So for me, that was Roger Kirby in the Edinburgh department. And he inspired a generation of remote sensing people coming out of that department. And I came away from there really with a good theoretical basis of photogrammetry. And I'd also learned from Roger how to use this Kern PG2 stereo plotter, which you can see in the picture. I think maybe some people have seen those or remember them from the distant past, but an amazing feat of mechanical optical engineering, but a really complex and temperamental beast. But we sort of got along pretty well together, and got me off to a good start with my career. After that, I worked for Oldham Council Survey team in the winter of 1987. Now, I'm pretty expert at sitting on bleak polar hillsides, waiting for survey equipment to do its thing. But I can tell you, I've never been so cold as working outside in Oldham over the winter in 1987. So there you go. After that, I had a job for a while at the Edinburgh Uni Geography Department, working on photogrammetry of the Imani Desert, again using the PG2 stereo plotter. And then after that, I went off and did a photogrammetry and remote sensing masters in Aberdeen. And on that course, there was a cartography module, and that was run by Michael Wood, who I think many people will remember as former president of BCS and the ICA. I did my master's thesis work in Svalbard over the summer of '89, riding on the back of logistics from a Scott Polar Research Institute expedition. And that was about mapping glacier change from time series, historical air photos using the PG2 plotter again, and field survey with an early total station. So you can see the beginnings of the direction that I've since been in. Whilst I was away doing the field work, the job at BAS came up. I obviously didn't see the advert, but my then girlfriend, now wife, Alison, applied for the job for me. That was very noble of her, actually, because BAS didn't really recruit women for fieldwork roles at that time, and she'd been turned away from the Durham University Careers Fair the year before. So it's actually very noble of her to set that up for me. Came back, had the interview. They always bowl you a googly question. So for me, it was, what's the most important scientific discovery of the last century? And I was just off a remote sensing master's, so I gave them something about seeing the Earth from space for the first time from the Apollo space mission and seeing it as this shining blue marble in the blackness of space or something like that. And that was why I wanted to work in an environmental research institute. So that obviously worked and stuck. So I got the job and then started at BAS in January 1990 as topographic map compiler, which was a 3-year post and kind of very junior entry level. And the main strands of the job were prepare regional scale topographic maps, editing of digital data for the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, Antarctic Digital Database, and I'll talk a bit more about that later, start a sort of geospatial help desk service and set up photogrammetry at BAS so that we could do detailed mapping from air photos. So look at what was the status of Antarctic mapping back then, early 1990. I think you could say that Antarctica was the least well-mapped area of the world at that time. A field survey had been done by the Falkland Islands Dependency Survey, FIDS, and the actual mapping work had been done by Directorate of Overseas Surveys, DOS. And then DOS became Ordnance Survey International in 1984. And really, since the 1970s, it had been a bit of a backwater. There'd been no real commitment to survey and publish mapping. And the coverage was very partial, really large areas of the southern part of the peninsula and deeper BAT hadn't been mapped since the 50s. And the continental interior was still only sort of sketchily known, and at 1 to 1 million scale. Remember, this was all before the era of satellite imagery, really. The different territorial claim areas were mapped by national mapping agencies. The US and Russian agencies had maps for larger parts of the continent. Antarctic mapping has always been linked to geopolitics, especially in the 50s and 60s Cold War era. There wasn't much international coordination over coverage, scales, projections, and so on. And it's still all based on aerial photography from the Cold War era, 1950s and 1960s. Satellite imagery really had very little impact by 1990. And everything was really only available as paper copy. It was the very beginning of the digital map era. So as we all know, all mapping has to be related to a geographic framework. So BAT has about 650 surveyed points, and they come from different surveys from the 1950s through to the 1970s that were all pieced together into a grand adjustment, but they were done with different methods and equipment and have 8 different origins. And it's only got about 11 meters overall accuracy, so not as good as you can get from a handheld GPS these days. And there are some problems with the network. There are weak links between offshore island groups and the mainland. And as you can see on the right, there's a huge gap down the east coast, and it's very sparse in the south. But it was a really great achievement when you think about the equipment and the transport that they used of the day and the difficult conditions that they were working in. So that one will just give you a kind of flavor of the kind of work that they were doing and the equipment they were using to put together that survey network. So the big step change really in knowledge came from aerial photography. The earliest substantial aerial photography coverage comes from 1947. So you can see on the left, you've got the Ronnie expedition that did tri-camera aerial photography in 1947. Then you had Hunting's working with the Falkland Islands Dependencies aerial survey expedition in the mid-1950s to do systematic coverage of the northern and western part. And then in the 1960s, the US Navy did a lot of tri-camera aerial photography as well. So the orange blob at the top of the graphic on the right is the systematic coverage, vertical coverage, mapping grade from the 1950s. The wavy green lines are the exploratory aerial photography from 1947. And the polygon inside the dashed line is covered by the US Navy tri-camera aerial photography which was an attempt before the era of satellite imagery to get horizon to horizon wide area coverage. Made a dramatic improvement in knowledge about the continent. Before then, everything had really only been seen from shipborne expeditions on the coast, and the interior wasn't particularly well known. And so for the first time, you got whole mountains, mountain ranges, glaciers that hadn't been seen before. And you can see from these photos the idea of the mountains marching off into the distance. In terms of early mapping from the 1940s, 1 to 200,000 scale, very sort of reconnaissance really, based on dog sledge overland traverses with bicycle wheel for distance, and then periodic check-ins with astrofixes and barometer heights. And then between the survey lines, the detail was sketched in from sketching in the field and later from photo panoramas. Really beautiful cartography, but if you look quite closely, the detail is very stylized. As Paul said at the beginning, one of my other hats has been place names. So I've just highlighted some of the nice place names you've got in this area with those red boxes. So Blow Me Down Bluff and the Amphitheatre and Mount Nemesis, they give you an idea of the sorts of things that the people working on that were thinking about when they were in the field. In the 1960s, DOS did a series of 250,000 scale maps. And now these were based on the aerial photography that had been collected in the 1950s and was an attempt to do more rigorous mapping. But it soon became clear that with that vast area and the limited ground control, it was going to be a costly and slow operation. And the priorities of DOS changed as well. So actually only 7 sheets were produced in the end at the northern end of the Antarctic Peninsula. And I know that the people who've been involved with the FIDASI aerial photography and survey were always a bit disappointed that their great work actually was never fully expressed as published maps. At the same time, the USGS have been working hard on their own series of 250,000 scale maps based on the US Navy air photos. They're really, really beautiful maps, as you can see on the left. And then in the 1980s, OS International had a go at very early mapping based on Landsat MSS scenes to try and build on the 250,000 series started by DOS, but I don't think they were particularly successful, limited by the kind of quality of the imagery available at that time in the 80s. For detailed mapping, that's really limited to just the areas around the stations and was always done in the winter by the surveyors as a winter project whilst they were waiting for the sea ice to be good enough to start doing overland travel and move from place to place. Just very simple methods really, plain table survey and sketching, but I think you can see the one of Horseshoe Island on the right, actually really beautiful pieces of art in their own right. And there'd really only been one attempt at pulling all of the international mapping together to kind of summarize what was known about the continent as a whole. And that was the Scott Polar Research Institute Glaciological and Geophysical Portfolio in 1983, which had been led by David Drury, who was then director of SPRI and later became director of BAS. And this was a precursor really to the SCAR Antarctic Digital Database project. So that's a kind of summary of where we were in the early period. So what's happened since then? So I'll have a quick gallop through some of the key developments over the last 3 decades. So the SCAR Antarctic Digital Database in the early 90s, the idea behind this was to make for the first time a seamless compilation of the best available regional scale mapping. So including rock outcrop contours, coastline, ice shelf front, and so on. There was a limited amount of digital data, but it really involved digitizing a whole load of stuff for the first time. So more than 200 map sheets were digitized, and new coastlines and ice shelf fronts were hand-drawn onto more than 200 Landsat MSS prints on film overlays, and then all of that was digitized. It took 3 years to complete. There's a team of digitising people based down at the Scott Polar in Cambridge, an absolutely huge task. And then here at BAS, we had the job of editing and cleaning the data and doing the QA. That was really my first job. So lots of work in patching data in from the digitising table you can see in the picture, doing lots of map editing on laser scan lights 2 software, later using ArcInfo. And then the thing was published in 1993 on CD with some generalized products, 1 to 1 million, 1 to 3 million, as well as the source scale at 250,000 scale. And it immediately had an impact by allowing updated or accurate computations of the areas of the continent and the ice shelves, and immediately reduced the estimate of the percentage of exposed rock from 2% down to 0.3%. And that was just purely based on the fact that more detailed data had been digitized and was available for the first time. So kind of tied in with that was the beginning of a new era of regional scale mapping. So now based on Landsat thematic mapper, as well as the data that was in the first release of the ADD, and all georeferenced to the existing BAT survey network. So the one that you can see on the left, James Ross Island, 1 to 100,000 scale, that's quite an interesting one. I'd finished it, and it was actually at the printers when we started to get reports in February 1995 of the catastrophic breakup of the Larsen A ice shelf, which used to connect James Ross Island here to the mainland, which comes down here. And the whole thing had broken up in just a period of a few weeks into millions and millions of icebergs and floated out into the ocean. I had to actually call back the map from the printers and update it and then send it back to the printers. Otherwise, we'd have ended up with thousands of copies of the map that were instantly out of date, which wouldn't have been good. Okay, for more detailed mapping with increasingly detailed fieldwork, there was a need for large-scale maps of key areas that were visited by scientists. And also the Antarctic Treaty System was starting to create a whole series of Antarctic Specially Protected Areas, or ASPAs, and they all needed detailed maps for their management plans. So there was an increased requirement for detailed mapping, but the problem was that we didn't really have the means to do anything about it, because at that time we didn't have any aerial photography equipment. The survey network was very sparse. We didn't have any photogrammetry equipment to compile the maps from aerial photos. And at that time, sophisticated survey and mapping equipment was really, really expensive, and really only the domain of national mapping agencies or multinational survey companies. And I think really the key achievement of the 1990s was to solve these issues in an efficient and low-cost way. So we were able to go into a relationship with the UK Hydrographic Office, where we could borrow a Zeiss RMK mapping camera from the Navy. And then in return for doing some tasking for the Hydrographic Office for their own purposes for charting, the RAF processed and printed the films for us. And we were able to get this camera alternate years from 1990 through to 2002, which was really, really helpful. And at that time, there's no way that we could have justified even buying a second-hand piece of equipment. So that was really fantastic for us. I put that picture in of Michelle because, as I said at the beginning, BAS didn't have a particularly good record in the early years of having women doing fieldwork. And I'm actually quite proud about the mapping department being a pioneer of having women doing deep field work, even from relatively early in the 1990s. So at that time, for control surveys, you could get GPS, which would give you centimetre level accuracy, but it was really expensive, heavy, needed a big battery and so on, and wasn't really that practical and was out of our reach. And we hit on the idea of using this thing called the Magellan Nav 1000, and that would allow you to get better than 10 centimeters accuracy from a known base station by differential GPS. And we use that to tie into the existing survey network. And that was enough really for us for topographic mapping. It was low cost and light and really, really tough, and did the job for us really well. In terms of photogrammetry equipment, the late 80s and early 90s were the era of analytical photogrammetry. So moving away from that very complicated mechanical PG2 instrument, where the relationship of the stereo photos was now worked out by software. And that made the instruments simpler than the very complex old optical mechanical plotters, but still very expensive engineering. But in the early 90s, the Norwegian Forest Service developed this thing called the AP190, which still did a proper analytical photogrammetry job, but was only about a fifth of the cost of a full-on sort of Zeiss instrument that there would be at the time. And so we got one of those and actually found that really, really useful for our purposes. And so now we're able to compile accurate, detailed maps comparable to what you'd expect in other parts of the world. But at that time, it was still very skilled and time-consuming work for the mountainous and snowy terrain. So moving on to the 2000s, keeping going with the SCAR Antarctic Digital Database. So by 1998, we got basic download of the data, moved away from CD, and then web services came in 2006. At that time, the main source of the data was still published mapping from national mapping agencies. And it was the period of some quite big changes in Antarctica, particularly ice shelf breakups, notably the Larsen ice shelf down the east side of the Antarctic Peninsula. And that generated a lot of interest in time series changes in the ice sheet and whether Antarctica was a good indicator for possible global climate change and so on. And we actually ran a project with the US Geological Survey to go through the whole archive of photos and satellite imagery and piece together coastline change. Interesting crossover with glaciology and climate change research. Some of that was published in quite an influential science paper in 2005, and also found its way into the ADD as a coastal change layer, and that's actually been much reworked and much used by other people since. And the whole thing was becoming quite well established by then, so we're running at thousands of downloads per year, and it's finding a wide range of scientific and operational uses. Key thing from the 2000s was International Polar Year, 2007 to 2009. Covers 2 years because you've got the Arctic and Antarctica, which have different summers. And on the kind of mapping side, the key thing was the Landsat Image Mosaic of Antarctica, or LIMA. And this was a collaboration between the US Geological Survey, NASA and BAS to find over 1,000 cloud-free Landsat 7 images and piece them all together as a seamless mosaic of the continent. And it was a complete step change, really, about the geospatial understanding of what the continent was like. And the UK role was to select some clip scenes for the Antarctic Peninsula. And the whole thing was freely available for any purpose. And there's a really nice website where you could browse and download the tiles. Had a really big impact. And also for IPY, we produced this double-sided continental overview map, which was quite a nice thing with Antarctica on one side and the Arctic on the other. And the work that went into that's been recycled into many other things. And the map's about to have its 6th reprint. And the availability of easily accessible, high quality, seamless Landsat imagery really turbocharged the regional scale mapping program, both in the UK area and elsewhere. And so we pushed on with a whole series of 1 to 250,000 scale or 200,000 scale regional maps, partly working with UK Antarctic Heritage Trust. So there's 4 double-sided sheets covering the Northern Peninsula, working with them. And also a new initiative to help support aviation safety was air operations planning maps at 1 to 1 million scale. And they were designed specifically for air operations use, with contours in feet, spot heights in feet and so on, and pilot specific information like fuel depots and so on. So that was the beginning of something that turned into an important continent-wide project. By now, the cost of GPS equipment had come down, and we were able to switch over to more geodetic standard equipment, and we're using that for control points for detailed mapping. At that time, Landsat satellite imagery, only sort of out of the box, had a spatial accuracy of a few hundred meters. So you're still needing to do ground surveyed work to actually pull the satellite imagery into its true position. So that was a big activity area in the early 2000s. And then in 2002, a key event was that we managed to get transfer of ownership of one of the Zeiss mapping cameras from the MOD. And then we immediately had that retrofitted with an upgrade for 5 centimeter accuracy GPS scene sensors. And that made a really big difference to us working in Antarctica, because it meant that we could then effectively do away with the need for GPS ground survey, and it made the whole detailed mapping from aerial photos idea much simpler and much more effective. Also in the 2000s, it's the era of digital photogrammetry, with that technology improving really rapidly in the 2000s, becoming much more reliable for difficult polar, snowy, mountainous terrain. And so we're now working with digital images with stereo viewing on computer screen, and it's effectively an end-to-end kind of digital working flow line now, and the whole thing's much more efficient, and we're able to really push on with large-scale detailed maps. So you can see some examples of the areas around stations, and being able to produce highly accurate, good quality, large scale maps to support individual field projects, really. Again, continuing with the ADD, by now it's really well established, more than 10,000 data downloads per year by the mid-2010s. I remember going to the SCAR Open Science Conference in Davos in 2018 and being really struck by how many of the talks and poster presentations were using data from the ADD, which was really nice to see. Increasing reliance on continent-wide satellite-derived data sets now rather than published maps. So rock outcrop, grounding line and so on, coastline updates coming from satellite imagery. And there's a nice symbiotic relationship now between the ADD and regional scale mapping, where you would check out data from the ADD, update it with satellite imagery or whatever, and then check it back in. And increasing developments with web maps and web services and other web-based systems are starting to pick up the ADD and take it as a kind of data feed into their own system, which is quite nice to see as well. And so the work that we ourselves have done on the web front end for the Antarctic Digital Database, we were able to leverage that now into other web-based geospatial GIS systems. So things like the South Georgia GIS that you can see at the top right, or the Antarctic Place-names Committee web map, or our own internal operations GIS. They all now sit on top of the kind of development work that's been done for the ADD. And then really the key event of the late 2010s was the reference elevation model of Antarctica, or REMA. And so the idea here is that the US National Science Foundation funded this, and the idea was to round up thousands and thousands of sub-meter resolution, stereo, very high resolution images, and generate DEMs from those, all date stamped at 8-meter resolution, and then release all of that completely freely for any use. And they deployed the US NSF supercomputer, which I had described to me as 100,000 desktop machines all working in parallel to chew through the data. and produce some of the output that you can see there. I think it's worth pointing out that that's actually not a satellite image on the right. That's actually the elevation model. So you can see the level of detail that there is in it. And that was a complete transformation in what you could do with generating accurate contours and spot heights and understanding Antarctica in a three-dimensional way. Again, continuing on with regional scale maps, and by now we've got up-to-date good coverage at 250,000 scale, pretty much down the Antarctic Peninsula. And that's one of the things that I'm actually pleased to be leaving behind as a legacy, is having that series of published maps, as well as some other regional scale ones, like we do one of Greenland and the European Arctic, which is quite nice. So yeah, you can see the Greenland one on the left, on the left there. Really nice one that we did for the South Georgia government of South Georgia, with the Shackleton crossing on the back. Managed to pick up a few commendeds and highly commendeds from BCS, which is very pleasing. And the whole thing's just, you know, much more efficient now with good quality digital mapping software and a wholly digital flow line from end to end. By now, the air operations planning map series has got traction, and there have been one or two aviation incidents in Antarctica that had highlighted the need for improving aviation safety and better situational awareness. So this has now turned into an international project under SCAR, which is led by BAS. And the idea is to cover the whole continent with a standardized format and style, with maps specifically tailored to aviation. So UK, Norway, Belgium, Australia, and the USA in the consortium, the UK doing 7 sheets and the overview map. And it's just about to be completed, with Australia filling in the East Antarctica coverage pretty much at the moment. And the idea is that it's all freely available as maps and as downloadable digital products, because we're trying to support aviation safety, and starting to be used on tablet apps in the aircraft. So either using something like Avenza Maps on an iPad that you can see in the bottom right, or now the thing that most people are using is a software package called 4Flight, which comes from Boeing. And the map data goes directly into that, and you can overlay the aircraft GPS position feed on top of it. In end of 2012, beginning of 2013, we were able to take over from the Ordnance Survey a ZI imaging DMC digital mapping camera. We would never have been able to justify getting that ourselves from new, because we would just never have got the use out of it. But to be able to take that over from the Ordnance Survey when they upgraded was fantastically useful. So this is now comes with centimetre level GPS and internal roll picture yaw measurement, and dramatically speeds up mapping work, and now gives you a completely end-to-end digital flow line. We removed the need for scanning digital film. It's wholly digital, from capturing the original images right through to the published data at the other end of the pipe, and a real step forward for us. So, I mean, you've all seen digital images before coming out of the camera like that, but just some indication of the kind of quality that we're getting. Really helpful. And so the combination of having that digital mapping camera and digital photogrammetry, and now the availability of stereo, sub-meter, very high resolution satellite imagery, really transformed what we could do with detailed mapping, and we really pushed on with that, particularly for areas that are inaccessible for aircraft, like South Georgia, for example, where it's 700 nautical miles from the Falklands and there's no airstrip, and you really can't get an aircraft there to do aerial photography. So something like sub-meter resolution stereo imagery really unlocked that area for detailed mapping, as you can see with the 2 on the right. So that's been a kind of gallop through what's been happening with mapping over the last 30 years, and how it's kind of now, for some areas anyway, on a standard with what you might expect to find in most parts of the world, and has got this amazing elevation model now at 8 meters resolution over the whole continent, which is actually better than many other parts of the world, which is a real turnaround. I guess we've been going for about 40 minutes. I've just got a few slides about the impact of applying those sorts of geospatial methods into science programs, and then just a little bit about possible future directions at the end. So I'll push on. So I think this idea of crossover of with geospatial methods and environmental science is really interesting. If you think about environmental sciences like glaciology, geosciences, ecology, many aspects of what they do are very geospatial. And I think that geospatial professionals have got a real lot to offer for collaborative working with those other fields. So you can allow scientists to access the power of modern geospatial methods without them actually themselves having to put a lot of time into learning about the data and the software and the methods. Maybe give insights on what's possible that they hadn't thought of themselves and new ways to approach old questions. And then, of course, we can bring our professional attributes of rigor, attention to detail, and understanding of error to the party. And also, geospatial people are used to working with large, complex data sets, evaluating which is the best and which isn't, and what the error from each is, and merging these diverse data sets together in a seamless way. And they can all have an impact on environmental science. So just some examples. Glaciology. There's been a lot of interest recently with applying rigorous photogrammetry methods to glacier change over time, looking at glaciers in a three-dimensional way to understand ice loss and how that might relate to climate change. So as I showed earlier on, some parts of Antarctica have got really nice quality photography going back to the 40s. Some areas have got 5, 6, 7 or 8 kind of epochs of aerial photography. They've always been very difficult to use because of the lack of the sufficient density of surveyed ground control, and also working in a photogrammetric way with snow-covered surfaces has always been very, very difficult. But actually, you can apply modern mapping methods now to generate DEMs and ortho images and do differencing of DEMs from different epochs to look at change over time. And also working with modern digital photogrammetry, you can extract a lot more detail from the original negatives than you could working in a more optical way. So the idea is that you would take modern aerial photography or stereo VHR imagery, do a photogrammetric orientation of that, maybe generate a DEM, and then pick points from that modern data that you can find on the historic photos and use that as proxy ground control, as if you've got tens of ground surveyed points linked to the old historical aerial photography, and then that way you can unlock it and then generate DEMs from it for all of those historical epochs, and then do differencing to look at change over time. So this is just a single example of a glacier around the corner from our main station. So the red line is how it was in 1989, the black line is how it was in 2005, and then you can generate a DEM from the two eras and then difference the two together and kind of get a change over time. And you can see that there's been a couple of kilometers of complete glacier loss. And then at the head of that bay, you can see that there's actually been a really, really significant thinning as well. There's been a lot of work by BAS and our collaborators, for example, at Newcastle University and other groups applying these sorts of methods to looking at glacier change in Antarctica. Quite impactful. Another nice area is wildlife census. So obviously you can get an aerial photo and try to count penguins or seals off it, but it's actually much better to apply a rigorous photogrammetry workflow and generate a DEM and an ortho image and mosaic those together. That means that each animal can only appear once, so you can't get double counting. You're taking out any dead areas or effects of terrain, so you can actually do a density against area population count, or you're also generating really nice source images to feed into some kind of AI automated counting algorithm or something. So we've done quite a lot of work on this at BAS, and we have a set of 50 penguin colonies that we do repeat monitoring of, working with WWF and applying rigorous photogrammetry through socket set to those. So yeah, there you go. That's part of Avian Island. So the pinky brown blobs are the penguin colonies. The pinky brown comes from the guano. As we go in a bit more, you can start to see the individual penguins and some seals on the left. And then down at 6 centimeters resolution, you can easily count the individual penguins. So as you can see, that's quite a powerful technique. And then also starting to apply drone photography to that kind of idea as well. So that's some recent work on South Georgia from a fixed wing drone. And then also we can use our kind of cartography expertise to produce products that kind of summarize and publicize big international data sets. So a couple of nice examples there, showing the bedrock surface under the ice of Antarctica and Greenland. And the BedMap 2 was the winner of the Bartholomew Prize in 2013, which was a really nice result for us. Okay, just a little bit to finish off now about future directions, how things might go. So where we are now, we've got really well established digital mapping workflows and software. They're really highly automated and efficient. So I think that the evolution now is in the systems to capture the source data and also in the delivery mechanisms. So for source data, the idea that we're trying to pursue at BAS is to build a portfolio of systems, and then we can select the best one for the task. So you can see you've got that spectrum there, from small kind of multi-copter drones through larger fixed wing drones. The big long range drone that we've got, the Prion UAV with 1,000 kilometers range, can carry quite a big camera. Traditional aircraft and mapping camera photogrammetry setup, and then right through to VHR sub-meter stereo satellite imagery. And they've all got their kind of costs and benefits, and it's about picking the right one for the task, really. Obviously, drones are a hot topic at the moment, and they've got fantastic potential for working in remote, difficult to get to, expensive places like Antarctica. So increasing use of drones, and actually we've just used for the first time the EBX fixed wing drone that you can see in the picture on the right, and that's got a lot of potential as a mapping tool. But we've learned along with other people that if you're going to do this well, it actually needs organizational commitment and investment to maximize the opportunity, and needs doing properly and not in a kind of half-cocked way. High resolution satellite imagery, that's clearly a key technology for mapping, but the question is, how will it develop from here? So at the moment, the limit that you can get from commercially available stereo satellite imagery is 30 centimeters. My understanding that that's tied up with legal privacy issues in the USA. But actually, I think for topographic mapping, certainly in the areas that I'm involved with, that's enough, and anything beyond that would give you diminishing returns, really. That's already at the level of an aerial photograph taken from 10,000 feet or 4,000 meters. So I think what's likely to happen, and what I want to see happen, is focus on increasing coverage capacity and reducing the repeat time, rather than continuing to push on the resolution, and generally try to get the availability and the cost down. And then lastly, in terms of delivery, so we've already got web services, so you can have direct feed of digital data from the ADD or South Georgia GIS into your own system. Increasing use of publishing maps straight to the web as web maps from the software. And we're already well established providing digital bundles of topographic data for use on field laptops with QGIS and ArcGIS and so on. At the moment, any kind of live app or a live web GIS isn't useful in the polar setting because the internet's just not good enough even on the stations. But I think what is an interesting area is the kind of apps for tablets area, which can be kind of summed up from maps and apps. So this is using something like Avenza Maps on a ruggedized tablet, or I mentioned before the Boeing 4Flight app that people are using in the aircraft, where you've got data loaded onto the system, and then you get a live feed of your position as you're traveling over land, flying the aircraft. And I think there's a lot of potential to continue to build on that, possibly even with some kind of app that's focused on tourists that gives you map background and also more rich other data layers on top as well. So I think that's quite an interesting area for the future. So that's it. I guess I've been about 50 minutes or something, so perhaps there's a little bit of time for questions. I'm certainly very happy to take any questions. So thanks for your attention. I'm pleased to see Michael Wood has popped up because I mentioned him earlier in the talk.
Thanks, Adrian.
Good.
That was a great talk. I really enjoyed that. It's great to see how technology has changed and improved so that you can better map Antarctica. So thanks very much for that. It's really
No,
interesting.
been a pleasure. Yeah.
No,
very happy to take any questions.
Well, there are a few in the chat. I mean, because there's not many of us. I mean, if people are comfortable to turn their cameras on, and like you said at the beginning, Adrian, if we want to make this, a little bit more informal and just have a bit of a chat, and people can ask questions as they want to. I don't know if Neil, if you're still on the call, if you want to ask Adrian because I see you've got a couple of questions in the chat. If you want to ask your questions directly to Adrian, you're more than welcome to do that. Or I'm happy to do it for you. Up to you.
Yeah. You can hear me, I take it, can you, Paul?
Yep.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I had a couple of questions actually. The first one was going back to, should we say, the old days of survey?
Yeah.
When you didn't have GPS and this, that, and the other, and indeed in the early days of GPS. How did you actually sort of mark your survey points? And the reason I ask is because was it just a case of you just found a bit of bare rock? Because obviously if you start trying to put it on snow, depending on whether it's glaciers or just snow, it either moves or gets covered. Yeah, so in the BAT survey network, there are those 650 or so points. Most of them were put in the 50s and 60s. And what they would do is they would choose a rock outcrop, and they were normally chosen for intervisibility with theodolite or later tellurimeter, and then they get marked normally with a 303 rifle cartridge, because at that time it's the era of dog travel, and they used to feed the dogs on seals. Right. And so there were lots of 303, ex-army rifles and 303 cartridges lying around, and they would use the spent ones and cement them into the rock. But so that one of the problems with that is that they were chosen for intervisibility and not for finding on air photos and satellite imagery. So they're not in the place that you would want them to be, on some kind of small outcrop that showed up well on the satellite imagery. They're on a high point on a ridge or something that would be silhouetted from other points in the network. So, but yeah, I mean, amazing feat of work, really, when you look back at the equipment they were using and the way they were living and traveling in the field. Well, I won't ask any more in-depth questions because this is the British Cartographic rather than the British Survey Society. On that point, my second one was you were mentioning that you were part of the forgive me if I've got the wrong terminology, but part of the British Antarctic Names Committee.
Yes.
I'm just intrigued on the fact that how does naming work across Antarctica when you've got both national claims, albeit supposedly in abeyance due to the Antarctic Treaty, but you've got that whole sort of geopolitical issue as well, whereby especially over the British area, you've got Chile and Argentina who might be wanting to lace the whole place with their names. How does all that work? Is it international or is it on a national basis?
So we and many other nations have their own gazetteer, and then there's the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research has this thing, Standing Committee on Antarctic Geographic Information, SCAGE. And one of the things that SCAGE does is maintains a composite gazetteer, which is a compilation of all of the individual national gazetteers, but it's completely agnostic about which name has primacy over any other name. But what it does is it links the different names together, because there are some places. So as you picked up on, the BAT area is also counterclaimed by Chile and Argentina. And also you've got Russians and Germans and Americans and many other South American names in the South Shetland.
So a nightmare.
So there are some places, I think the worst example is the same thing's got 7 different names. So what the composite gazetteer does is it links all of those 7 names together and says these are the same feature and applies a number, a code to them. But it doesn't do anything about resolving, the kind of potential conflict between the two, or the different names. So that's where the spirit of cooperation in Antarctica kind of comes into play, really. And so we have very good relationships with most other countries, and you can normally amicably sort those things out. But I mean, you can't get away from the fact that, so King George Island is, is also named by Argentina as 15th of May Island, after their National Independence Day. So that's not really a resolvable problem. And so, we just have to kind of rub along and deal with that as best we can, really. So.
Right, well, thank you very much. I won't monopolise the questions, but I know that, is it David Fairburn, I think, has also got a question, so I'll hand over to him.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't realise Neil was passing it over to me. As you know, Adrian, I brought students down to your headquarters in Cambridge several times, and always been impressed by your fancy building and expensive facilities. And I'm just wondering what you think the future of BAS is in terms of funding, because I would imagine that in many circumstances you might find yourself rather vulnerable.
Just to say that I'm retired and I no longer work here, and I'm not the head of the mapping department anymore. So I don't really know, but what I would say is that BAS has had an enormous amount of infrastructure money spent on it recently. If you look at Sir David Attenborough, we're in the process of procuring a new aircraft. There's a long-running, a kind of 10-year into the future program of infrastructure works on the station. So I would take that as evidence that the UK government is pretty committed to the UK's presence in Antarctica, and BAS is the way that is expressed, really. Okay. What happens on the science side, that's quite a different thing, and maybe you can see sort of increasing linkages between BAS science and university science. That's certainly been the trajectory over the last 10 or 20 years, but that's not really my area of what happens on science policy. But I mean, I feel very optimistic for the organisation that I'm leaving, because there is this commitment. You know, why would you throw all that money at the ship and the aircraft and the stations if you didn't see an ongoing role for the UK and Antarctica, really? That would be my personal view.
Right. Just a very quick follow-up. I'm just wondering, as you have some input into the Gazetteer, whether there is actually a feature in Antarctica named after yourself.
Yes, there is.
There is. Right.
So it's not actually in British Antarctic territory. So it was a name that was done for me by the US Geological Survey. And it was tied up with that coastal change project that I spoke about earlier on. So as a spin out from that detailed work about changes in the coastline and glacier fronts, that revealed the fact there were lots and lots of glaciers that didn't have a name. And so there was a naming campaign led by the US Geological Survey. And one of those names was applied for me, which was very nice.
Yeah. Well deserved.
And have you got a copy of a map with that on? Because I know I'd be doing that straight away if that had happened to me.
So actually, I'll just move to the back. It just kind of sneaks. I don't know if you can still see me, but it just sneaks on this Antarctic Peninsula map down here in the bottom left-hand corner. I don't know if that worked for you or not. No, I think you lost me, didn't you? Yeah, so our map MISC 13, which covers the whole of the Antarctic Peninsula region, it just sneaks in the bottom left-hand corner.
Are you worried by the fact that the commercialization of your map products may mean increased tourist pressures on Antarctica? Is that a factor in the publication schedule that you have?
So I don't think our mapping work is driving increased tourist interest. It's the other way around. The tourist interest is being driven by the tour ship industry and, you know, wider environmental awareness and, you know, programs like Frozen Planet and all the rest of it. You know, so what we do is try to provide products that support people who are doing that. You know, so our map of South Georgia is aimed partly at being a valuable product for people going on the tour ship visit to South Georgia and so on.
Sorry, I need to shut up. Ken had his hand up a long time ago. Sorry, Ken. I think we should get you
Thanks,
in.
David. Yeah, just very briefly, Adrian, going back to your first point about 303 cartridge cases, I started my photogrammetry career back in the late 60s and spent a lot of time playing with slotted template laydowns, trying to identify 303 cartridge cases buried in a block of concrete under 20 feet of snow. It is not easy. So
exactly, yeah.
Great fun.
So you will recognise some of those old instruments then, the Telstra
yes.
and the PP2 and things. So.
We actually went very much upmarket in the UKHO. We actually had a Vilt A8 and a Vilt B8.
Yeah.
And something called a G6 plotter, which the Italians have made.
Yeah.
But what I was going to get onto was the Zeiss camera that you put in the Twin Otters. I had a lot of fun working that out with the guys at Man Aviation at Fair Oaks, putting the camera unit into the back of a Twin Otter, then flying around for many hours to make sure the thing worked. And when we got it all up and running, taking your pilots up to RAF Cosford, where we could teach them to fly straight and level. Brilliant pilots though they were, absolutely amazing guys. But trying to teach them to fly air survey was quite interesting when you showed them the results, what they thought was a perfectly straight and level flight.
Yeah.
But that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And
so I
retired now.
I actually learned to operate the Zeiss RMK camera at the JSOP course at RAF Cosford.
Yeah.
So I went there in 1990 before I did my first season to learn how to operate the camera. So
that was probably just after I'd moved on to do other things at the
Okay.
UKHO.
Yeah. No, it's an amazing piece of equipment, and you know, obviously now superseded because you can't get the film, and I don't think you can even get the film processed even if you had some stock. But we ended up taking over 2 of them from the MOD when the Hydrographic Office stopped doing aerophotography in the Lynx helicopters off the Endurance. And actually one of them's now in the Polar Museum at Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge. And then we have the other one still in our store here. And we're thinking about having it as a kind of display item in the foyer here as well. So nice to keep hold of it and not just throw it in the skip.
Yeah, we actually started off with Endurance when she had the Wasp helicopter, and they used to take 2 down south on Endurance, and we had the old RAF F-49 camera, which was the one that was basically for the 1950s photography.
And many of the air photos that are actually in the archive, like the US Navy tri-camera photos, they were often with a F-49 camera.
I'll keep quiet now.
No, cool. Thanks, Ken. Well, thanks, Ken, David, Andy. They're great questions. Are there any other questions from anybody? Has anybody else got their hand up that I've missed? If there is, feel free to shout your question out or.
Quick.
Who was that? Did somebody have a question? Oh, maybe it was just my end. Okay, cool. We don't want to keep you any longer. All it leaves me to say really is thank you, Adrian, so much for coming along tonight.
No, thanks. No, I always enjoy talking about stuff to do with Antarctic mapping. Once you start me, you often can't stop me. So.
Yeah, I've seen you talk a couple of times actually at different Regis events, and I always find your talks really interesting.
Well, it's easy for me because I just get to show lots of nice pictures. So.
Yeah, and who doesn't love a good map? But also, Adrian, I know you had a thunder and lightning storm, didn't you, earlier? So you've had to make your way to the BAS offices. So
yeah, I was planning to do
easy.
I was planning to do it from home, but we had a big thunderstorm this afternoon, and the electricity went off in the village, and eventually came back on, but the whole phone system's down. So I've got no telephone and no internet at home. So I had to come in here and then do it from in here instead. So.
Oh, well, even more, thank you so much for doing that, because obviously, not been easy, but thank you for taking the time.
No, it's been a pleasure.
Coming along.